The look at the biggest accomplishments, the setbacks, and the challenges during President Joe Biden's first year in office. Today is the anniversary, and the president gave himself high marks at his news conference yesterday afternoon, saying he, quote, probably outperformed what anybody thought would happen. Now, 1 year ago today, Mr. Biden was sworn in after a very contentious election that divided the country and amid a pandemic that has now dominated American life and continues to do so, unfortunately. Ed O'Keefe shows us all that has happened over the last 365 days.
My whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people.
During his first speech as commander-in-chief, President Biden promised to tackle the nation's many challenges.
No justice! No peace!
But unity quickly proved hard to find. Racial justice protests continued, while teachers, parents, and students bristled at plans to keep schools safe from the coronavirus. The new administration ramped up vaccine distribution and passed trillions of dollars in financial relief.
We're closer than ever to declaring our independence from this deadly virus.
Over the summer, the pandemic took a temporary backseat to foreign policy, as a controversial decision to end America's involvement in Afghanistan sparked chaos.
I was not going to extend this forever war, and I was not extending a forever exit. Here we go.
The administration succeeded in enacting major infrastructure legislation.
Let's believe in possibilities. Let's believe in one another.
But plans for an ambitious spending bill remain stalled. As fall turned to winter, supply chain disruptions and inflation sent consumer prices soaring. And a new COVID variant sparked long lines at testing and vaccination sites once again.
We have to do more. We have to do better. And we will.
Still, the president kicked off the new year pushing for voting reform and blasting his predecessor's supporters.
They want chaos to reign. We want the people to rule.
And unity in Congress, like in much of the country, continues to remain elusive. For CBS Mornings, I'm Ed O'Keefe at the White House.
For more on what happened and what it means, we are joined now by CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist Joel Payne and Steve Hayes. He is co-founder, CEO, and editor of The Dispatch. Gentlemen, good morning to both of you. That was a nearly 2-hour-long press conference yesterday. There were questions from conservative outlets, liberal outlets, middle-of-the-road outlets, foreign language outlets, international outlets. If it went any longer, dogs and children were going to be asking questions. So if you could, Joel, off the top, help us take away kind of the headline. What was the big message that you got from those 2 hours?
Well, I think some of the message was nonverbal, which is I'm the president, I can stand and take the heat, and I've got the endurance to do the job. And I think that's part of what his team wanted to do. They wanted to reflect that you have an engaged president, you have a president that is focused on the job at hand. He did make some news for his team. Unfortunately, they had to do some cleanup afterwards related to issues in Russia. He made some comments about potentially Russia invading the Ukraine, which his team, again, had to clean up afterwards. And I think he also made news around the Build Back Better agenda, revealing that that is going to have to be broken up into multiple pieces of legislation. So, you know, press conferences like that, they really don't move the needle. I think that they more reflect a direction. And I think the direction of this president is to attempt a reset as we look at the beginning of 2022.
Yeah. Steve, the president in his inaugural address promised to be a unifier for the country. He campaigned that way as well. Unfortunately for the administration, people seem to be unifying around disapproval at the moment. Do you think that press conference changed the narrative in any way?
I don't. I mean, I agree with Joel that, you know, if endurance was one of the measuring sticks, he did well. I mean, I think people were surprised that he was able to stand up there for 2 hours and answer questions. But I think he raised as many questions as he answered in several different ways. I mean, if you look at his comment about a minor incursion by the Russians into Ukraine, you saw immediate reaction from overseas, particularly in Kiev, where officials said, boy, that seems like a green light for Vladimir Putin. You also had the president's comments on the possibility of an illegitimate election in 2022, when he was asked a question about whether if these voting reforms that have been debated in Congress don't pass, that would contribute to the illegitimacy of the 2022 elections. I think the right answer would be to reaffirm the strength of our electoral system while, you know, expressing disappointment that the reforms were unlikely to pass. Instead, he said, yeah, it's possible that the 2022 elections could be illegitimate, which I think is not what we need, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or conservative.
I know. So, Steve, how is that helpful? And doesn't that set up a tit-for-tat dynamic that I think is very troubling on many issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worrisome. I mean, look, if you're a conservative and you've got questions or problems with the way that Donald Trump conducted himself in the aftermath of the 2020 election, lying about whether the election was stolen, trying to remain in office, what his supporters have been doing in states and localities across the country, to basically put themselves in a position where they could muscle through an illegitimate election. The last thing you wanted to hear was to hear from President Biden that there are questions about the legitimacy of the elections. You needed the president to say, no, we've got the best electoral system in the world.
Yes.
The safest, the most secure. And one thing we don't need to worry about, even if I'm frustrated that Republicans aren't supporting me on these voting reforms, the one thing that we can be sure of is that the elections will be legitimate.
Joel, you mentioned it briefly. The president said that he is considering breaking up the Build Back Better plan. Is it as simple as just giving in and trying to pass it in chunks, as you said?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, part of that would be you'd still need to get 60 votes for some of that. Now, there are parts of that agenda that if you maybe offer it up piecemeal, you could maybe get to that 60 vote threshold. You got folks like Senator Romney who might support parts of that agenda. You've got other moderates in that Republican caucus who might support part of that agenda. And I think for probably some of the president's allies, they're looking forward to an opportunity for him, again, to reset and to focus more on a unity message, getting back to the messages of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, right? Bipartisan, bringing Republicans along. On the other hand, for a lot of Democrats, you've got a lot of frustration that some of the core progressive agenda items, voting rights reform, some of the more, expansive parts of the Build Back Better agenda are probably not going to get passed in this cycle of Congress.
But Joel, the two big parts of Build Back Better that the president cares about a lot, he said, are free community college, so the country guaranteeing an education 2 years beyond primary school, and also a child tax credit, which can lift millions of kids out of hunger. If those are broken off and passed, does that change the narrative for the midterms? I mean, it looks like they're going to lose at the moment. Could those bills, those separate pieces, change that?
Well, Democrats have to decide whether or not they want to tell a positive story about this presidency. If you look on one hand, you could say you passed a major infrastructure bill. You already passed the big COVID relief bill, which had some child care tax credit in it last year. And you've got a chance to pass a little bit more going into 2022. And that's something you could sell to voters as you look at the midterm elections. You could tell the story like that. You could also tell the story in a way to say we're not getting as much as we want. And I think what the president is probably trying to do, among many things, bringing the country together, is also bucking up his party and getting his party to feel good about the work that they've done over the last 13 months. And so I think part of the president's job is psychological here to get his party on board.
All right. Payne and Hayes, a political consultancy. You guys could work together. There's a little ring to that. Payne and Hayes.
I like that. There we go. All right, we appreciate you guys. Thank you so much.